Shiviti Adonai L'negdi tamid Ki mimini bol emut Lochen tzomach libi Vayagel kevodi Af besari Yishkon lavetach Ki lo ta'azov nafshi lishol Lo titen chasidcha lirot shachat Todieni orachayim Svas machot et ponecha Neimot b'mincha netzach.
I've set the eternal always before me. God is at my side, I shall not be moved. Therefore does my heart exult and my soul rejoice. My being is secure. For you will not abandon me to death, nor let your faithful ones see destruction. You show me the path of life. Your presence brings fullness of joy. Enduring happiness is your gift. We this morning come with great sadness and love for Shirley Levine, our mother, our grandmother, our aunt, our friend, a woman who in her 93 years tied so many people together. So many of you I know this very intimately of the way in which she impacted your lives. And 93 years is a life long lived. It was a life well lived. We are saddened in our loss, but we are also grateful for Shirley's life. Today, as we find comfort in the words of our tradition and in the memories we share, I hope that we will bring honor to her memory and give gratitude for her life. Continue with Psalm 23, Psalm of David.
Mizmor LeDavid,
Psalm of David.
Adonai Rohi lo echsar.
The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want.
Bino deshe yarbetzeni.
He maketh me lie down in green pastures.
Al me menuchot yenahaleni.
He leadeth me beside the still waters.
Nafshi yeshovev.
He restoreth my soul.
Yanacheni b'magle tzedek leman shemo.
He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake.
Gam ki elech begetz al mavet, lo irara ki ata imadi.
Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me.
Shiftecha umishantecha, hema yenachamuni.
Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me.
Taharoch lefonai shulchan neged tzorerai.
Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies.
Dishantov Hashem en roshi, kosir vaya.
Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over.
Ach tov v'chesed yerdefuni kol yamechayai.
Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life.
Beshavti beveit Adonai liorech yamim.
And I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Amen.
Amen.
We think about Shirley's life and the many places across Canada she lived as her life journeyed westward from Halifax to Montreal and eventually here in Vancouver. We think about all of the places that she saw, but more importantly, all of the people that she connected with along the way. One of the most beautiful psalms that I find in our tradition is Psalm 121, which says that a a person lifts up their eyes to the mountains to seek help, to seek holiness and sacredness. Shirley ended up in the mountains here in Vancouver, but you can imagine that along the way that she was able to lift up her eyes in her quiet sense to find, pray, a sense of wholeness, a sense of calm that she exuded then to others. Psalm 121, Esa Einai El Haharim.
Esa Einai El Haharim, me'ayin yavo Ezri. Ezri me'im Adonai, Ose shamayim v'aretz. Al yiten lamot raglecha, al yanum shomerecha, hine lo yanum v'lo yishon, shomer Yisrael. Adonai shomerecha, Adonai tzilcha al yad yaminecha, Yomam hashemesh lo yakeka, v'yareach balaylo. Adonai yishmarcha mikol ra, Yishmor et nafshecha, Adonai yishmar tzeitecha uvoecha, me'ato v'yad olam.
I lift my eyes to the mountains. What is the source of my help? My help comes from Adonai, maker of heaven and earth. God will not let your foot give way. Your protector will not slumber. See, the protector of Israel neither slumbers nor sleeps. God is your guardian. God is your protection at your right hand. The sun will not strike you by day, nor the moon by night. God will guard you from all harm. God will guard your soul, your going and coming, now and forever.
Amen.
Birth is a beginning and death a destination, but life is a journey, a going, a growing from stage to stage, from childhood to maturity and youth to age, from innocence to awareness and ignorance to knowing, from foolishness to discretion and then perhaps to wisdom, from weakness to strength or strength to weakness, and often back again. From health to sickness and back we pray to health again. From offense to forgiveness, from loneliness to love, from joy to gratitude, from pain to compassion and grief to understanding, from fear to faith, from defeat to defeat to defeat, until looking backward or ahead, we see that victory lies not at some high place along the way, but in having made the journey stage by stage, a sacred pilgrimage. Birth is a beginning and death a destination, but life is a journey, a sacred pilgrimage made stage by stage, from birth to death to life everlasting. Take a moment now, silent prayer as we remember Shirley. Yesterday I learned wonderful things about Shirley from her family, in particular how she reached out to help to raise so many children and grandchildren and nieces and nephews, I suppose, nephews. And I want to invite her granddaughter, Elaine, to come forward to share some of her reflections of her grandmother.
Hi. Yesterday was my birthday. I'm 48 years old. Upon reflection of how fast the years are going, I realized my grandmother was 43 when her first grandchild was born. That would be the equivalent of me having a 5-year-old grandchild right now. That's a difficult thought for me to process. It just made me realize how cool my bub Shirley really was. I always saw her as a grandmother, but when I put ourselves side by side, I see her as a young, hip grandma who would have had to have been exceptionally cool. Even though my children wouldn't agree, I think I'm totally cool, and I'm 5 years older than my grandmother was when she became a grandparent. When I was 19, I was visiting her in Florida, and she was always good about listening to my music. The song Just Can't Get Enough by Depeche Mode came on, and I was singing along. She said, "Are they saying just can't get it up?" Horrified, I said, "No, bub," not even thinking my grandmother could possibly know what that was referring to anyway. Now I'm convinced she knew. My grandmother was always on the go, running all over the place until she was well into her 70s. We went shopping one day when I was in my 20s, and we were outside the store waiting for them to open. As soon as the door opened, she rushed ahead and she flew in. Everyone was staring at me, so I just said, "She doesn't get out too much." She would outlast me on any given day with her energy. Another time I was visiting Florida in the early 90s, I took her car and she insisted that I take a cell phone, back when they weighed 20 pounds and had huge antennas. She said Papa Jack always took one with him and I should have it in case of an emergency. I said, "Bub, what emergency will possibly happen?" That was before I knew about all the parade of horribles that I know today, so I took the phone. She told me what spot to park in when I came back. I called her from the cell and I said, "Bub, I have an emergency. I can't remember which spot you told me to park in." So there it was, my grandmother always knew best. To my brother and I, she was Bub. To Adrian and Jordan, she was Grandma. To other family and close friends, she was Auntie Shirley and Bub Shirl. She threw the best Hanukkah parties. Many of us here have such fond memories of her latkes and smoked turkey, snowballs, and opening up gifts in the basement with the walls adorned with family pictures. My grandmother was all about family. Nothing made her happier than knowing we were all together, whether she was there or not. If she knew I was visiting with Heidi or Jay or Mark and Joan, Adrian and Jordan, Alan and Helen, Jeff and Cindy, she used to say how happy it made her that we were all together. When Adrian was born, I remember being in Florida, and she was literally waiting by the phone for the call. We couldn't even go out. She knew how much I loved Swiss Chalet, and when Adrian was 6 years old, he wanted Burger King. So she got him Burger King, and then we went to Swiss Chalet, and he ate the Burger King, and I had Swiss Chalet. She just wanted to make everybody happy. My grandmother also had her share of heartbreak, like we all do in life, and the birth of Jordan was such a blessing and brought our families more together. She got to become a grandmother all over again to a new generation, and she was so happy that Jay and I, as first cousins, could be such a big part of Adrian and Jordan's early lives. When Josh was born, she said, "Now I can die." That was 16 years ago. Since then, she was able to see her 4th great-grandchild, Nolan, grow up, and all the achievements of her 4 grandchildren and 4 great-grandchildren. I feel so blessed that my grandmother was able to be a part of so many of my life events: my high school graduation, my wedding, my ultrasound when I found out I was having my 2nd son, and especially Adam's bar mitzvah. What a blessing it was for her to present Papa Jack's tallis and make the speech that she did. That was a special moment for the whole family. Even though she was not well enough to attend the other 3 bar mitzvahs, she wanted to go so badly, but she was there in spirit, and that she was so happy that we were all celebrating together. This is something I kind of added. It reminded me of yesterday when we were going to clean out her stuff. After Papa Jack died, she called a family meeting to go over who she wanted to have what. We were sitting there waiting for this big pot of gold, and she brings out a mug with my picture on it. Thank you, Adrian, for taking that. A tea bag holder, a necklace that she found in a parking lot in Florida. I said, Bub, I don't want a necklace you found in a parking lot. It's not sentimental. There's no sentimental value to that. Most families fight over things like, I want this, and I want that, and I want this other thing. Not us. We were fighting, you take it. No, you take it. No, you take it. But that was my grandma. She just wanted to, make her mark and know that we had something of hers, whether she found it in a parking lot, whether it was something she had from 20 years ago. She just wanted us to have it. I'm so grateful that my grandmother moved to Vancouver when she did. She had such a great level of care. She used to always say it was like living in a resort, that everyone took such great care of her. To Mark and Joan especially, thank you for making sure she had the quality of life that she did. What a blessing to have been able to be with her when she took her last breath. I'm so glad I got to FaceTime with her before, and she was aware of who I was. Bub, I would like to thank you and Papa Jack for helping to shape the person I am today. I would not be here or where I am without your love and support. In my lonely world of teen and adulthood, I've always had the both of you. You are the only people who I ever truly felt loved me unconditionally. If you look at our whole entire family, including extended family, you are an integral part of all of our successes. I know you will be watching over all of us, and as you are being embraced by Papa Jack and Mike, and we will all continue to make you proud. We love you so much, and you will be sorely missed. You will continue to live on in all of us. I love you.
Thank you, Elaine. Beautiful memories. I want to now invite Mark, if you would, to come share some of his memories of his mother.
Elaine, that was beautiful. You've captured my mother in ways that I couldn't possibly hope to do. And given what you said and having characterized, please let me know if you can't hear me, having characterized the kind of person she was and the impact she has, I'm going to try to put some historical perspective on her life and her effect on all of us. But first, I'd like to start at the last 8 years of her life. These were spent at the Louis Breyer Home and Hospital, where the care she received was outstanding. She felt at home, she felt secure, she felt safe, she felt cared for and loved. I can't say enough about the quality of the staff and their interaction with her and with us through those years. I would just like to mention a few that come to mind. I'd like to thank Debbie and Irma, and Josephina, and Edie, and Nomi, Rebecca, Jennifer, and so many others who remain unmentioned but are in our thoughts. And to thank Dr. Kadeski for the attention he gave to my mother and the assistance he gave to the staff who really were the people who cared for her, and his responsiveness to us whenever we had questions or issues to raise, and his assistance certainly as for the staff at the end of my mother's life. We're so grateful for the 8 years that she had there. And as I said to one of the staff yesterday, I used to be on the board of directors for some time, at Board of Governors at the Louis Breyer. And with friend Marty Putterman, we had to do some preliminary work to assess what the long-term needs would be population-wise, demographically for the Louis Brier. And from the data we received, we discovered that, in fact, the life expectancy of people who entered the Louis Brier exceeded that of almost every nursing home in the province of BC. And I truly believe it's because of the quality of care that people receive in that very special place. So thank you all very much. And staff have come up to us prior to my mother's death and shortly thereafter, just thanking us for her having been part of their lives and their community, and pointing out to me and to Joan what she brought to the Brier, her kindness, her gentleness, her tolerance of others, her engagement, her involvement in the daily life and the community and the activities that they had to offer. And they characterized her so well, they really got to know her. So thank you so much for that. I guess it's fitting that my mother died initially I made the mistake and thought it was a Victory in Europe Day, but it was actually D-Day. She died on the anniversary of D-Day. And Joan and I were fortunate enough last year, with her help, to visit Normandy and see the beaches of Normandy, where the Americans, the British landed, and Juno Beach, where the Canadians landed. And it had a great impact on me because, as I think of it now, my mother, most of us are the post-war generation and are echo boomers who are our children. My mother and my father were the war babies. They were born between the wars. My mother was born in 1923. My father just at the end of the First War, 1918. And so my mother spent the first few years of her life in Montreal. And in fact, she told me years ago her next door neighbor was an Italian immigrant, and she claimed that she was fully fluent in Italian for the first 3 years of her life, but forgot it thereafter. So early on, they moved to Halifax, where they joined a small but vibrant Jewish community in Halifax and began to build a business in dry goods and eventually a clothing store. And my mom really grew up in Halifax. And her sister was born when my mom was about 10 years old, so there was quite a distance between them. But her sister Marilyn and she were close and have been close ever since. And I think Marilyn is watching this as we speak today. So if you're there, Marilyn, please know we're thinking of you and we love you, as you loved my mother. Marilyn always said to us that my mother was, because of the age difference, she was like a mother, a sister, and a very best friend. And I think that was true. So they grew together in Halifax. My mother apparently was an outstanding student in school. She did very well in all subjects, especially reading, grammar. She loved to spell. She loved to write. Her Achilles heel was mathematics. My mother was math-phobic. And she was all of her life, in fact. So it was the one thing that kind of held her back. In fact, when Joan and I were going through her things, I came upon a small wallet where she had a small card that indicated to you how much to tip for how much money that you might have to spend for lunch, because she had a great fear if she was taking someone else out for tea or for lunch and she was paying the bill as a gift, she wouldn't know how much to give as a tip. So she had this little assistant in her wallet, which was kind of neat. In any case, she thrived in the community in Halifax, and then came the war. So my mother, the Jewish community in Halifax, I gather, established a hostel for the servicemen who traversed and transferred in and out of Halifax to and from various locations. And many Jewish servicemen from Canada as well as the United States came through this facility, and my mother and other young people in the Jewish community did their best to make them feel at home and to assist them. And it was there that she met my father, who was stationed in Halifax for a time and then was transferred and ultimately served in the Royal Canadian Air Force in Newfoundland. So he was overseas at the time. But they met, and somehow they decided that they wished to be married. That wasn't the best news to my grandmother, apparently, but they were determined, and my mother would not take no from my grandmother for an answer, and so they determined to be married, and they were. I found out only recently that that they had a difference of opinion with respect to when to start a family. My father did not want to think about starting a family until after the war because he wasn't sure that he would return. And my mother wanted to start a family right away because she wasn't sure that he would return. And my mother won the day, in fact. So my father did transfer to Newfoundland. My mother became pregnant, and my sister was born in Halifax. She was born one day before, she was born after VE Day, a couple of months after VE Day in August, one day before the Americans dropped the first atomic bomb over Japan and hit Hiroshima. So the war in Europe was over, but the war in Japan was not to be over for a couple more months. But as the war ended, the thought was that my father would be discharged, but he wasn't discharged. He was required to be transferred to Vancouver. And he actually did come to Vancouver, even though my mother was pregnant and expecting. And no, by that time she would have already been born. So he was transferred to Vancouver and served here for some period of time. And my mother began to write letters to the head of the Royal Canadian Air Force, the commander who is involved in the placement of servicemen, and told him her situation and requested that he be discharged. And he did not have enough points at that point to be discharged, apparently. But he did send him back to Montreal. And so my mother joined him in Montreal, and they finally discharged my father in 1946. And that began my parents' lives in Montreal, and both of them had said that when they got together after his discharge, they looked at their bank account and they realized they had $20 and a young child between them, and that was how they started life in the big city. They lived initially with my grandparents, who made it through the Depression but were very poor people. So I actually don't know how they did it. But that's when my father did have a job to go back to, and that probably explains it. So they lived with my grandparents, and I was born 3 years later. I was born in 1949, the same year that my father had determined he was going to start his business, a dress manufacturing business. And so they borrowed the money, he had a partner, and they began their business. And within 3 years, they were able to buy a house, one of the new small bungalows being erected, post-war bungalows in Montreal, in a district that had not yet been, the ground had not yet been broken. And I remember, this is one of my earliest memories, as a 3-year-old visiting that house as it was being completed, walking across the muddy ground and so on in the late spring. And finally we moved in, I think in the fall of that year, to this new house in Saint Laurent. This house was one of the first on the block to be occupied. It later filled up quite quickly. But I remember that first winter I was in Montreal. In those years we had large snowfalls in the city, and there was lots of snow in the back. And I was out playing back in the snow, and it turned dark. And I realized I didn't know which house was mine. And I started to shout, and my mother came out in the back, and she found me, and she brought me back into the house, and she said, "If you ever feel lost in the back, just look for the house with the garbage cans. That's our house, right here." So that's how I found my way back home. So it's our mothers who give us our lives. But it's the first 10 or 12 years of our lives, I think that for many of us, if not most of us, it's our mothers who have the greatest impact on the people we will become. And this was certainly true in my case. During those early years in Montreal, I remember certain things with clarity, and I remember them well. My mother actually had a beautiful voice. Joan and my mother were very close, but I don't think Joan realized what a lovely voice she had. And as we were talking about this over the last days, I think I was thinking back to a song by one of my favorite musicians who died this past year, Leonard Cohen. I was born like this, I had no choice. I was born with the gift of a beautiful voice. My mother had a beautiful voice, and she sang lullabies to us, and so I realized the power of lullabies, as we probably all have experienced, those of us who have children. She would hum and sing, and she actually sang in one of the women's choirs in the synagogue in Montreal, and the synagogue became the center of attention, the center of the community, just as the JCC is here for many Jewish people in Vancouver. And so my parents were both heavily involved in volunteer work, in social work, and active work within the community through the synagogue, and that began to establish their social sense within the city. And of course, Saint Laurent, where we lived, and other neighborhoods began to expand as Jewish people post-war began to make their way, and others began to make their way into the suburbs. So it's those early years that I remember actually very, very well. And as I said, our mothers, I believe, have a very strong formative effect on who we will become. And as I said, this is certainly my case. My mother had a love of reading and a love of books. And this she passed on to me. She would read to me incessantly. So much so that of course, as probably happened with your kids over time, the children memorize the books and they read them back to the mother by memory. And this certainly happened to me. I actually remember a couple of the very early books that my mother read to me. One was Stories by Hans Christian Andersen. I don't know if any of you had that experience. And another was the great story of the Ugly Duckling. And I would say that the Ugly Duckling, as I recall, was the first literary character with whom I personally identified. So it's true. It's a neat story. So during those formative years, as my parents the business was growing and they were actively engaged socially, they began to get involved in bowling and golf. They took up golf, which was lovely for them because it became the center of their social life. My mother never could golf very well, but she said it really didn't matter. She was out on the course, she was with her friends, she was having a good time. And it was being, as Elaine said so aptly, it was being with her close friends and her family that really meant everything to her. Her tolerance and forbearance were really vitally important to me, and her encouragement for me. And I'll give you a couple of examples to illustrate that. I guess when I was 10 or 11, I showed a strong interest in science and chemistry, and she supported me by initially buying me a chemistry set, and it soon evolved into a laboratory in her basement, in her laundry room, which I pretty much took over with her approval and support, because I couldn't buy the chemicals that I needed. You'd be horrified to know the chemicals that I actually had. And she bought them for me. She bought the equipment for me from Fisher Scientific. She allowed me to take over her room and set up this laboratory. I don't know if she knew all the things that I did down there, but she trusted me that I would not blow up the house. I came close once or twice, but she supported all this and supported well. And just to show you, and I became interested in biology as well as chemistry. With her love and support, I set up a little biology center in the basement. And she bought me my first dissecting set. And again, she realized this wasn't a kid who just wanted to kill animals. This was a child who was curious and interested and wanted to learn things. And so she helped me, some cases, purchase animals to dissect. In other cases, I caught them, but I didn't want them to suffer. So you may not believe this, but it's true. In order to anesthetize the animals, I was able to go to our local pharmacy and I bought a glass syringe and needle. And I bought a bottle of chloroform. They sold this to me. I was like 12 years old, right? And no, really. And so I anesthetized any live animals. I anesthetized them before I would dissect them. And my mother knew I was so interested. I had books on frog biology from my cousin's high school class, and she knew I dissected a small frog or toad because that's all I could find. And apparently, her friends told me this was a true story. She was out on the golf course with them one day, and she inevitably hit a ball off the fairway toward a pond, toward the water trap. And she goes over there and she sees a huge bullfrog. So she dropped her clubs and thought, I can get this bullfrog for Mark, right? And she apparently, this is true, she apparently chased this bullfrog. I had this picture of she didn't get it, but I'm thinking, what would she have done if she actually got the bullfrog? I can't imagine her picking up a bullfrog and bringing it back home, but she tried. She thought about me and she tried. So besides reading and besides her encouragement for my whatever intellectual curiosity I had, she encouraged me to think for myself, to form my own ideas and opinions regardless of where they led. little knowing that they would lead to places that would not necessarily make her and my father very happy in terms of my religious conviction or lack thereof and my views of things. But she trusted that these ideas and thoughts and beliefs came from the best place. And so the fundamental values on which these were built really came from my parents, and certainly my mother had a major influence. So, as we went through this sort of period of time in Montreal, I went to university, my sister got married, and my sister had the first 2 grandchildren. As you've heard from Elaine, my mother was in her early 40s when she was a grandmother, and a vibrant and active grandmother she was, and I don't have to reiterate, I think Elaine's described that beautifully, and it's really the way she was, and she loved and cared for Elaine and Jay more than you can imagine. And both my parents were instrumentally important in Jade and Elaine's formative years as well, both spiritually and financially and in other ways. And they both on both sides appreciated this greatly, and it was really the actions and decisions of my mother that guided this whole episode and sense of support in their lives, and became the foundation on which they built their lives. I should have said earlier, during the visits to Halifax, when I was very young, we went by train the first few times, as I remember, because I had a terrible fear of flying when I was very young. It was a gift given to me by my grandparents from Halifax, because they would come into Montreal several times a year on purchasing trips, right? And they would buy, or order goods for the store, and at the same time buy kosher foods and things in Montreal that they could bring back to Halifax. And they would sleep in my room because we had this tiny little bungalow. And I remember their visits very well, and I remember them coming in by train, and I would ask them why they came in by train, and my grandparents said, "You don't fly, those things crash, right? They're terrible, you crash. We don't go on a plane." And so that was my gift from my grandparents at that particular time. But on these early trips back to Halifax is when I got to know my cousins Alan and Jeffrey. And this family has been tight-knit and close ever since. And I remember well meeting my Uncle Dave, who was from Europe and a survivor, and who grew up near the border of Hungary and what is Hungary and Czechoslovakia today. And I remember being very young, I might have been 6 or 7, the first time I saw the tattoo on his arm. And I'd asked my mother about this tattoo, and this was the first time I'd heard really about details of the war and about the concentration camps and the way the Jews were treated. And I asked my uncle, and he said at the time, he said, "I won't tell you the whole story now, but you should know that 3 times I was standing in front of the gas chamber, and for different reasons each time I survived." And he did, and survived until really quite recently. And only later in his life did he tell his full story, which was, as so many stories are, quite amazing. So that connection to the war and the fact that we were early post-war had certainly a strong influence on me as well. So after my years in Montreal, I went to university in Hamilton and Joan in Toronto, and eventually in 1975 we made our way out west here to Vancouver, where we had visited and decided this was a place we thought we could live for a number of years, and we came, and I was going to school again, and Joan was working here and completing her PhD, and we thought we'd be here a few years, and now it's 42 years later, and we're still here, except for a few breaks. My parents would come to visit often, and when Jordan and Adrian were born, I should say, by the way, when we transferred in 1975, this is when we got married finally in Hamilton before we moved. And when Joan told my mother that we were going to get married, she was thrilled because she loved Joan intensely. But she said, "Are you really sure? Are you really sure you want to do this? He's not the easiest guy to get along with in the world." And she said, "Yeah." Well, she did. So we moved here. She visited, and they visited on many occasions, and they really enjoyed being here. My dad had told me numerous times how they almost ended up in Vancouver because of his placement here until he was transferred back to Montreal. And then, of course, as time went on. They continued their social lives in Montreal, but as the years went on, their friends became older. Their friends became grandparents and great-grandparents. And because of the exodus in the mid-1970s from Montreal to Toronto and elsewhere, because the Jewish community was not decimated, but it was depleted significantly in Montreal because of the political situation, many of their friends began to transfer and move, Ottawa, Toronto, visiting more with friends and family. Their golf course was still intact for a while, and they played, but they were getting on in years. And then it came the time when their house began to require greater care. And my mother said, I just can't do this anymore, right? And she had indicated to us at some point she'd always be willing to move to Vancouver, but wasn't sure that my father ever would. And when really we knew that they'd had it with the house and they really did have to move, they were visiting out here. I think it might have been for Jordan's bar mitzvah, and the Oak Gardens facility had just been built, and there was an apartment or two still available, and we took my mother there to see it, and she loved it. My father, we didn't even talk to him about moving to Vancouver, but my mother said, we said, what do you think? And she said, well, I'd love to move to Vancouver. I said, should we buy the apartment? She said, well, find out what it is, and we'll go back to Montreal and then let us know. And so I called them and let them know, and my father hadn't seen this apartment. He hadn't seen Oak Gardens, but he knew about Vancouver. And I said, there is this one apartment left. It would be perfect. It's 2 minutes from us. It's right across from the Louis Brier. It's right next to the JCC, and most importantly, around the corner is Kaplan's Delicatessen. He said, okay, let's buy it. So we did. He hadn't seen it. And that's how we brought them out to Vancouver. And in Vancouver, they found warmth and friends and family, of course, the family and the proximity to Elaine and her kids and Jay and Trudy and their boys would come out every year for a visit. So we were together on many occasions, and they really had wonderful years here. They were welcomed by native Vancouverites and by other immigrants, other Jewish and non-Jewish people from other parts of the country who'd come to Vancouver, often centered around the Richmond Golf and Country Club. We worried about my dad because he wasn't the most social person in the world, not less so than me, but he wasn't the most. And yet they joined the club. They were welcomed. They felt they were part of a great family, and it was just fantastic. And they settled in so beautifully. My mother continued. I should have told you, she volunteered for years, at least once, sometimes twice a week, in the Rehabilitation Institute in Montreal. She volunteered here for the JCC and participated in activities at the JCC. She volunteered as a reader, and she taught kids at Osler School. She read to them, actually, kids with learning disabilities. She read to them on a regular basis. She just loved to read and loved to read to children. And so that's how their life progressed until 2009, when my dad suddenly passed away after a cardiac procedure. My mother was still living at the Oak Gardens apartment, and she was doing well, but only 2 or 3 months later, just as Passover approached, she had an accident. She fell in her apartment, and it wasn't a terrible fall, but somehow the way she fell caused her to fracture her hip. And so we got her to the hospital, and it turned out to be not a terrible fracture, but actually she needed 2 weeks at VGH and another 4 or 5 weeks in extended care or in rehabilitation at UBC Hospital, which was great because I could visit her every day. And she lost weight. She weakened. She had trouble feeding herself. She was really in a deeply affected state. And so as she began to recover and heal, she said one day, where will I go? What will I do? And I said, well, what do you think, Mom? Do you think you can go back? We knew she couldn't go back to her apartment. I said, do you think you can go back to the apartment? And she said, I don't think so. And I said, well, I don't think so either. Where would you like to go? And I was hoping she would say Louis Brier. And she said, well, where do you think? And I said, well, there are options and opportunities. And I said, there is the Louis Brier. And we'd already visited the Weinberg and the Louis Brier as part of the community. We'd been there and seen it, which was good. And she said, well, do you think I could get into the Louis Brier? And I said, I don't know, but I'd be happy to ask Peter Kafka, who is the CEO. And so I phoned Peter, and we spoke to him, and he checked with everyone, and there were 2 rooms available. And I told her, I said, but you can't go to the Louis Brier unless you can transfer, unless you can get off the bed and onto the bed, into your chair, out of the chair to the washroom and back. But she couldn't do it at that time, and she was so motivated. She spent the next 2 weeks getting ready to get into the Louis Brier. They held the room for her, and we got her into the Louis Brier, which was an amazing story for us. And she had a lovely room on the main floor, and the rest is history. As I said, the people cared for her so beautifully, and she had a vibrant and active life there. And as I said, Louis Brier is very special. I had done some clinical work and research work at a number of nursing homes, and none of the ones I had seen were anything like the Louis Brier, because the life in the Louis Brier is vibrant. They have social activities, they have music therapy, they have arts and crafts programs, they have a writing club, they have all sorts of activities. And my mother would try everything. She said, I'm going to try everything, and then I'll go to the ones that I really feel I can contribute to and I like. And this is what she did. And one of her major activities was the writing club, and I knew she was in that, and I'd seen some of the pieces she wrote, and when I saw Naomi Fenson the other day at the Brier, she said, I have some of your mother's pieces, would you like to see them? I said, I'd love to see them, and she emailed me yesterday or the day before my mother's pieces, and among these pieces was one piece written collectively by the group in the Writers Club. And Joan and I, in leaving Louis Brier yesterday, we walked through the room where they were having their meeting, and they all expressed to us how much they were going to miss my mother and how she read to them and how they really enjoyed and appreciated her. And her friend Flora, who's now 99 years old at the Louis Brier, expressed this best of all. So I found that one of the pieces that Naomi sent, as I said, was written by all of them, but I can see my mother's hand in this piece. And if I can make it through, I'm going to read it to you. So this is Rosh Hashanah Reflections, written by the club in the fall of 2013. I think there's something in here for all of us. As my life unfolds with all its mysteries and surprises, as my world becomes a smaller place, I learn to paint on a smaller palette. I pay attention to the small details. They're as important as the big ones. I try to do tikkun olam katan, fix the little things within my reach. It really comes down to relationship, how I act and how I react with others. Every morning when I wake up, I have a choice. Will I choose slavery or freedom? Will I be a better friend to myself and to others? Will I take an interest in others? Will I notice that they are not just here to serve me? They have names, families, joys, and troubles. Will I try and understand my neighbor? Will I take the time to listen, really listen? Will I discover something new? As the year 5775 approaches, I will be a better friend to myself and to others. I will appreciate the surprises that sweeten my life. A grandchild calling, a letter from an old friend, a kind word from a stranger, a win in bingo, which my mother didn't play, so that's not her. I will be more grateful for the friends I do have, for the health I do have, for the choices I can make. As my life unfolds with all its mysteries and surprises, I will look for the magic in unexpected places. Well, I think my mother found the magic in her friends and family. And I think our lives are all richer for having had her in our lives. When the end came to her, it came as a surprise to us. But it came gently and softly. She was comfortable and quiet and calm. And for Joan and me, spending the last days and really the last hours and the final breaths with her, he was a final gift that she gave to us. So that's the story of my mother's life. Thank you for listening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. Beautiful, beautiful speaking. I actually wanted to start my brief remarks where you left off, Mark, with the writers group at the Louis Brier, because I did know Shirley. Every month, Temple Sholom hosts a tea party for the Temple Sholom residents of Louis Brier and Weinberg, and Shirley was really a regular of the group. And one of my earliest recollections was the first year I was here of those members who were part of the writers group sharing some of their work, of their memoirs. And the truth is, I don't really remember what Shirley wrote about, but I can remember very, very clearly how she read. I remember her voice and her tone and how they were so clear and matter of fact. It was just her style. She was not overly sentimental. She was a straightforward and calm presence. As we've heard this morning, Shirley lived a life of great humility. She never sought credit or attention for her deeds. She did things because she cared about doing right for others. She was a woman of exceeding generosity of spirit. Her relationship with her sister Marilyn was a true example of her character. The way in which she took care of her younger sister, helped giving guidance and support when she needed it and when it was lacking from their own parents. I learned that the sisters really thrived despite the family dynamics that surrounded them. And the way that she continued that relationship in caring for her nephews, for Alan and Jeffrey as well, showed that beautiful sense of compassion and care. We heard about the way in which her role as a mother and a grandmother allowed her attribute of humility to shine. She stepped up so many times to take care of others, to put others first. She was such a fundamental presence in the lives of Cheryl of blessed memory, the way she helped to raise Jay and Elaine in Montreal, the way in which she came here to move to be a presence in the lives of Jordan and Adrian, to be here with Mark and Joan. Life was slower and more relaxed in these years in Vancouver with Jack, but she continued that sense of wanting to give of herself to others, to help with family, to help, as we heard from Mark, reading to children. She was a giver. For some mothers, the desire to be helpful can come with a tendency to step in, to smother a bit. And Shirley gave her support in different ways, probably more healthy. She never interfered, was never critical. She was respectful of boundaries and let her children and grandchildren find their ways. And that is an incredible gift that she has given to so many. Our sages tell a story about a conference among trees and of the decision that the trees were to make about which tree would be the king to rule over them. So they sent a delegation to a shade tree, which bore no fruit. And the delegation inquired, "Why do you make so much noise when the wind blows?" The tree replied, "The only way that I will be known is by making a lot of noise." And then the delegation turned to a fruit-bearing tree, and they asked it, "Tell us, why are you so quiet? Why do you not let yourself be known? Even when the wind blows through your branches, you are silent." And the fruit-bearing tree replied, "I do not need to make a lot of noise to call attention to myself. My fruit testify for me." In this fable, our rabbis were telling us that there are two types of people in the world. There are those who make a lot of noise, who demand recognition and honor because otherwise they fear that they would have very little to recommend them. And the second are those who are quiet, modest, and yet as full of kindness and love for others that they do not need to clamor to call attention to themselves. Shirley was such a person. She was a quiet person, a humble person, a person of character who led a fruitful life and whose fruit continue to bear honor and meaning in our world. Yehi zichrona livracha, may her memory always be a blessing. And we say together, Amen. In a few moments, we will make our way to our Temple Sholom cemetery in White Rock. There are directions on the back of the handout should you need them. After the internment, the family will be gathering at Mark and Joan's home for a meal of condolence and invite all of you to please join them. We'll continue now with the El Malei Rachamim, our prayer asking that Shirley's soul be bound up in eternal life, after which I'll invite the pallbearers to help to bring the casket out. Please rise.
El Malei Rachamim shochein b'meromim hametzei menucha nechona tachat kanfei hashechina b'mahalot kedoshim utahorim K'zohar harakia mazhirim et nishmat Sarah bat Mordechai v'Esther sheholachol li'olamo Began Eden tehei menuchata Ono bal harachamim hastirecha beseter kinofecha liolamim utzror bitzoror hachayim et nishmata Adonai hu nachalata betanuach b'shalom Al mishkava v'no more. Amen.
Compassionate God, eternal Spirit of the universe, grant perfect rest in your sheltering presence to Shirley Levine, who has entered eternity. O God of mercy, let her find refuge in your eternal presence, and let her soul be bound up in the bond of everlasting life. God is her inheritance. May she rest in peace. And let us say,
Amen.
Invite the pallbearers to please come forward.